So, good afternoon, everyone. This session is Getting Your Poetry Published, and I'd like to introduce you to Isy Mead from Poetry School, who's going to host the session. So, over to Isy. Thank you.
Very nice. Okay, hi, good afternoon, everyone. So my name's Isy, Artistic Director of Poetry School, and I'm delighted to have with me Fahad Al-Amoudi from Penguin, and Jane Commane from Nine Arches Press, and Amy Acre from Bad Betty Press. I'm also published by Live Canon, so I can also talk about the process from a writer's perspective of working with Live Canon. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask a few questions, and then we'll have a chance for some Q&A from you guys. Hopefully the basics will be covered in the main questions, but anything else we'd be glad to hear from you. Okay, cool. So we're going to start with just an introduction to your presses. If you could just let us know a little bit about how they came to be, how long they've been around, where you're based, etc. So should we start with Fahad? Cool.
Can everyone hear me all right at the back? Thumbs up? Okay, cool. Yeah, so as mentioned, I work at Penguin, specifically the division Penguin Press. Not really sure how to introduce Penguin, but in terms of poetry, we've been publishing poetry since around 2014. The first collection that we published was Citizen by Claudia Rankine, and we've been going ever since. Perfect.
Cool. Jane?
I'm Jane Commane from Nine Arches Press, and Nine Arches was set up in 2008 in the West Midlands. We're currently based in Rugby in Warwickshire. Published about 140 poetry books, collections and pamphlets in that time, and we're on our about 34th edition of our magazine, Under the Radar. And we're very much about doing the work of supporting writers, really, and of making sure that poets can have collections, publication, editing, mentoring and support with their work, and access basically to audiences through books and through live events and workshops and the whole variety of other things as well.
Cool. Amy?
Hiya, I'm Amy Acre. I run Bad Betty with Jake Wildhall, who you might have seen on the stall outside. We started in 2017. We started out in London and now we're based in Nottingham. And we started publishing poetry with the aim to showcase stories less often told and voices less often heard. And we run a programme of live events, like we do a live poetry tour, and we publish collections and pamphlets and anthologies.
Perfect. So really exciting opportunity to hear from the publishers themselves. And these are, some of the best presses that we have in the UK. So really hope that you're taking notes. It's a lovely opportunity. Okay, so we're going to start with the question that maybe lots of you have. What is the process in approaching you with poetry manuscripts? So if I just talk from my experience as a writer with Live Canon run an open pamphlet competition every year, which I entered. Wasn't the first time I'd entered. So that's how I got into working with Live Canon. Interested to hear from other presses. So should we start with you, Amy, just to go back the other way?
Yeah, so our process is pretty straightforward and transparent. We have submissions windows once a year, so we'll be open for submissions for a month, or a month for collections and a month for pamphlets. We do it that way so that we can kind of read everything in one go and then make decisions for the year ahead, or actually now it tends to be 2 years ahead. And we'll ask for 10 pages of your manuscript, and then from that we'll read everything and we'll select a short list, and then we'll have lots of difficult conversations where we say no to lots of work that we love, and then get the kind of small number of books that we have the capacity to put out in a year. It's always worth saying you don't need an agent. You can come to us through an agent. We have taken on poets that way, but it's not something that is necessary. When we're open for submissions, we put all the guidelines on our website, so you can find all the information on there. And if publishers will always have guidelines for your submissions, but it's not to kind of make you jump through hoops. It is just because the people reading it are humans who are kind of fitting it into everything else they're doing and just making it kind of manageable. But yeah, it's all there on our website.
Lovely. Jane?
Sorry, I'm recovering.
Oh, wait, do you want a minute? I can move to Fahad.
Yeah.
Okay, go Fahad.
So yeah, we're open for submissions all year round. Although it's not completely required that you need an agent to submit to us, I would probably recommend it in our instance. The majority of submissions that we receive tend to be agented, and that tends to be the majority of the posts that we publish, although it's not necessary. Quite unique as of this year, we no longer have a single poetry editor working at Penguin Press. There's now a team of us, a team of poetry editors. So there are multiple people who agents would submit to in that instance, depending on things like taste, suitability, etc. So yeah, that's quite an exciting change from this year.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, lovely. Okay, Amy?
I think I'm all right now. Sorry,
Oh,
I've
bless
been
you.
recovering from a bit of a throat infection in the last fortnight, so I occasionally lose my voice. So Nine Arches, our process of submitting work is quite similar to Bad Betty in that we open once or twice a year. We also have a magazine called Under the Radar, and that is a route for people to try their work out with Nine Arches. So that's open again twice a year. It's open submissions. We don't charge for you to send work to us. It's completely free. It's mostly online, and the system usually is a process of either sending work to the magazine, which doesn't guarantee we would want to publish a collection necessarily, but it's a way of kind of testing your work with us and sort of trying to see if we are sort of in a similar ballpark. And then we have the open submissions process through Nine Arches, open portal for submissions once or twice a year. All the guidelines are on our website, and they give a bit of information about what we're looking for. Generally, we get about 150 manuscript submissions each time we open, and I take one or two of those.
Wow.
We can only publish 12 collections a year, so we'll probably take one or two, maybe three sometimes, from those twice a year. And then we will also have submissions that sometimes come through other routes. Sometimes we do have agented submissions as well. And sometimes we do have submissions where I just really like somebody's work and I have enjoyed reading or hearing them perform, and I'll write to them and ask if they would like to send me work. So sometimes that happens too. Yeah. So there's a little bit of a mix really in terms of how the work reaches us, but generally we try to keep like an open submissions policy at least once or twice a year so that we can read those manuscripts as well.
That's wonderful. I love the open submissions policy. I think poetry is quite unique in that sense, actually. Cool. So a couple of things from this. Amy mentioned about the difficult conversations, and you were saying how the odds are quite difficult. 1 or 2 out of 150 submissions. So yeah, how do you craft a rejection? If you really like something but you just simply don't have the capacity. Anyone want to answer that question?
I think this might sound like an obvious thing, but I think it's really important to remember that a rejection of a particular poem or particular manuscript isn't a rejection of you as a writer. It's not a sign that you should give it up and do something else. It's always an incredibly difficult decision. There's always you might be sitting on 20 fantastic manuscripts and yeah, you can take 4. Sometimes something's not right for the press. Sometimes your work is more suited to a different press. Sometimes it's not right for the press in that particular window just because of what else they're taking that year and wanting to make sure that the list is diverse and varied. There's a lot of things that weigh into it. So it's very often you're saying no to a book that you love. We were just talking about this in the green room. So it's never as simple as this wasn't good enough. I think it's always worth continuing to submit to more places, and you might say, I'll try another 5, and if I don't get takers, maybe I go back to the manuscript and look again. And it's always helpful to get mentors or just peers to look at your work and give feedback if you're finding that, especially when there's a stage, I think, where you start getting onto the long lists or the short lists, but not quite getting taken. And then it could be really helpful to get some sort of outside eye on your work to kind of get it over the edge. But often it is just, it's just the kind of random context of where your book lands and what the press are doing when your work arrives with them. So, yeah, I mean, we try to send helpful rejections because we know it's hard, and we've all been on the other side of that as well, and continue to be, because that's part of the process.
That's a really nice answer. Any others to add, or?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because all three of us are also writers as well. So we are, as Amy says, often on the other side of that process, and I think that does enable you to have a sense of, well, sometimes awful guilt about writing to people and to say, I'm really sorry, but I won't be able to take this on, because we know that those rejections can sometimes feel to you as a writer that it's like a rejection of you, a rejection of all the things you've worked for, a rejection of all the work. But I think it's really important, as Amy said, to sort of separate that really, and to know that there is often so many other competing factors, and there are so many reasons why a manuscript at a particular point in time may be very good, but maybe not quite right for that publisher. So I do tend to try and reflect that. I do tend to try to let writers know where they are in that process as well. So if they've been shortlisted and it was very close, if there's something in terms of maybe the structure of the manuscript they've sent that has prevented it perhaps from making it to the final 2 or 3, if I can give that feedback, I tend to ask, would you like me to give you some feedback if useful, if it's very close? I can't do that for all the manuscripts because there's just so many. And I think it's also just important to check the writer wants that feedback as well, and that it's going to be something that might be useful to them. But just also giving a sense perhaps of where it's sitting, and any rejection that you get is in its own way a form of feedback, which I think is useful to bear in mind. And it is a form of assessment by only one person, so that's also worth bearing in mind. And that it's important to be in that process of sending your work out, because actually by the sense of other people reading it, of being aware of your work, of sending it to magazine editors, you are frequently getting that assessment and feedback. And also your name is going to stick with people. They're going to recognise, and they might turn it down this time, but who's to say that it's not a door shutting forever, particularly for magazine publication for poets. Being rejected once by a magazine doesn't mean you should never submit to them again. And it may be worth talking to a publisher and writing back if it has been quite close to either ask what you can do to make that next step happen, or what factors might have been part of that decision. They may not always be able to tell you, and they may not always be able to give feedback, but if it's been particularly close, it might be useful to do that as well.
Perfect, thank you. Is there anything you wanted to add?
I mean, I don't know how much I can add to the two.
No. I think it's I think it's sufficient. And then there was another thing that just pulled out of that first question, which is the idea of the submission window. Personally, as a poet, I like submission windows because it gives me a deadline, and then I'm working towards the deadline. But then again, it's annoying because if your work isn't perfect, you want to give yourself another week. So, there's pros and cons of both. So I'm wondering if we can just talk to those, because you've got different structures. So you both have submission windows and you just open. Anything about the pros and cons of having a submission window versus not?
I mean, like being open all year round, I guess, doesn't have that pressure. But of course, because the majority of submissions we receive are agented, then the authors will kind of be working to their own timeline that they've worked out with their agent. So I guess like windows do exist even in an open structure, but maybe not to the same extent as with other places, probably.
Lovely. And do you get overwhelmed by your submission window, or is it cool?
I mean, we get like a few hundred submissions in each window. We've got quite a good system now for me, which is that Jake reads everything and makes the long list, and then we look at everything together. So the windows are in July, and then he has a busy August. But Yeah, I think having the windows, although it can be annoying for a writer if you're not quite in the right place. Also, we want to publish people that have chosen to submit to us for a reason, and often those people will be aware of when our submission windows are in advance, because it's all on our website, and so they'll be kind of preparing for that earlier in the year, and that tends to be more likely to be a good working relationship anyway. And I think if you're more kind of just seeing what's out there and you miss the window, then someone else will be open the following month anyway. Cool. So there always are opportunities.
Perfect. Lovely. Okay, so next question, which also I imagine lots of you are wondering, is what are you looking for in a poetry manuscript? So this could be content craft, or it could be, the way that it's presented. So would anyone like to go first? Should we start with Jane? Yeah.
That's a really tricky question, isn't it? But a really nice one in lots of ways, I think. I guess I'm looking for distinctiveness of voice. I'm looking that the writer trusts their voice and isn't necessarily trying to write like anyone else. They're writing like themselves, and they're trusting that that's the core thing that is at the beating heart of their work. And I always think if I read a manuscript and a couple of days later I'm still thinking about it, the poems have stuck with me, that there's a sort of sense that something is really memorable about it, that it calls me back, that it can survive repeat rereadings, and there's still something that I want to excavate in the poems and spend time with, then that for me tends to be a sign that I feel quite excited about the manuscripts. And I think I'm looking for that sense that the writer has been deliberate as well in their decisions about what they've put in, about how they've written the poems, what forms they've used. And it's not like there's any wrong or right way with that. Again, going back to that sense of trusting themselves, there's a sense that they are able to do that and are sort of really engaged in the idea of what making a poem might mean for them as a writer. That excites me.
Oh, wonderful. Fahad, anything you look for in a poetry manuscript?
Yeah, I mean, just to echo everything Jane said, and also maybe to add something maybe a little bit transformative, something that really moves me, something that transforms how I feel and think about whatever the subject matter or subject matters of that particular collection might be. Voice is really important. Some kind of originality or style or aesthetic that's quite ambitious or quite different. Something that just really kind of gets me out of my seat. I'm quite open-minded. I think all editors are very open-minded. So yeah, it's something that's going to kind of transfigure or transform the imagination, the intellect, the spirit, whatever it is.
Wow, cool. Amy?
Yeah, those are such great answers. I really agree with all of that. And I think this thing about voice, it can be quite hard to explain or to understand what that is when you're, especially when you're working on your first kind of full body of work. And I think often when a manuscript almost gets chosen and then doesn't, it's sometimes the thing that stops it getting over the line is when, say, you can see someone's influences too strongly in the work, or where it reminds you of other work. And so it is that thing, as Jane was saying, of really trusting your own voice and trusting what you have to say. And it might be that you need to spend some time really exploring what that is and what your voice is, not just in terms of how you write, but in terms of what you write about and what you want to shine a light on and what stories you want to tell, and how you can do that in a way that no one else could do. That is only your way of saying it. And I think you know it when you read it. Like this conversation, this question comes up a lot, and it's always hard. I've spoken about this, I think, before with Jane and other editors, about how it's just that feeling when you read a manuscript and you just kind of fall in love with it. But I think it is that that kind of uniqueness and that feeling that someone has really gone deep into who they are and what that means for their writing. And we all obviously take on influences from around us all the time that make our work stronger, but then there's, I think, a kind of a shedding of that where you refine that into where you're coming from and your kind of worldview.
Wow, interesting. So what's coming up really is this idea of something that's transformative, something that's unique, something that's your own voice. I guess to know that, you would have to know the general poetry landscape, do a lot of reading and know how you might be different. So you've, as Amy says, you've got your influences, but then, and you're writing into those, you know, you're experimenting, emulating their different styles, but then at some point you know your voice. So I guess what I'm getting from this is you have to know a lot about the poetry landscape as a basis in order to see how you're unique. Would you agree? Yeah, do a lot of reading. And I might do some crass advertising of poetry school if you want to do our courses, but I won't. Although
Poetry school is brilliant. Yeah. Highly recommend. 5 stars.
Excellent. Cool. So what advice would you give to poets just starting out? So maybe not at the point of having a collection, but wanting to have a collection in the future. Do you want to start, Amy?
Yeah, I think it's kind of what you were just pointing towards, like immerse yourself in the world of poetry as much as you can, in the community, join a group or a class, or, you know, if you haven't got money to spend on a class, then, you know, have a group of friends that you share poems with and get feedback on, and go to open mics and events and just absorb as much of it as you can and read. It's all kind of straightforward stuff, but I think often when people are starting out, like, you're so excited by your own writing, sometimes you forget that you need that input as much as you need to put work out, and that's the thing that will kind of make you realize what's possible. Yeah, I remember when I started going to poetry school workshops, and you know, it was great bringing in a poem and getting feedback, but the best thing was reading other people's poems and really becoming aware of what you can do with this art form and how kind of multifaceted and expansive that is.
Lovely. Fahad?
Yeah, Echo, yeah, workshopping is a really invaluable resource. That tight-knit community of people who are going to challenge and push you and encourage you, I think is really valuable as well. The other thing I would add is read widely, read curiously, read things that are in your wheelhouse, read things that you hate. Just kind of read as like widely and diversely and curiously as possible, because I think it really enriches your writing, and I think it kind of gives you permission as well to like enter yourself within the lineage of writers that are out there, whatever traditions you're writing in, or whatever like genres or themes you're writing in. You kind of can help. It helps you kind of like insert yourself within that tradition, which is really permissive and wonderful. Yeah, I think that's what I would add.
Lovely. Actually, that reminds me of something. I was on a course with Don Patterson, and his advice was read bad poetry. So you know, so you know what good poetry is. However, that's quite subjective. I like the way you said poetry that you hate, because it's more about your own understanding what your own likes and dislikes are. That's great. And Jane, anything about what advice you'd give to poets just starting out?
Yeah, I think that's really good advice in terms of reading, and to do that work of reading widely. That is so valuable, because what you're doing is you're finding sometimes the things that will be touchstones for you as a writer for years to come. I can remember first encountering Alice Oswald years and years ago with her poem Dart, and just thinking, oh, you can write a poem in the voice of a river? Brilliant. Okay, I didn't realise I could do that. And it's a form of permission giving, you know, from reading other writers' work and just thinking, oh, wow, okay, that's possible with this. I can write in this form, or I can write in this particular way, which I think is hugely valuable. An idea as well, I really like the idea of reading work that you don't enjoy sometimes as well, and that key thing of sometimes understanding what it is that hasn't quite worked for you. And sometimes I found those poems that I haven't enjoyed, I've sometimes gone back to them a decade later and seen something different and appreciated them in a different way, which is also great for you as a writer to see your own development and change, and also to understand the things that just don't work for you. So you don't have to spend time necessarily doing something because it's something somebody else has done. If you don't really enjoy writing that particular mode or that particular way, you can understand and appreciate it, but you can also say that's not kind of how I want to do poetry. This is something that really interests me. And you, by reading, are expanding those boundaries every time. I think also the wonderful thing about poetry that perhaps doesn't exist in other genres is the community aspect of it, the fact that there is support, there are networks, there are organisations, so wherever you are, there's going to be hopefully something relatively close to you, and online as well, that there are places where you can come into contact with poetry as a living, spoken, heard, read, performed art form, and being involved in that is great fun. And if there isn't something near you, you could start something. And generally, the entry point to poetry doesn't have to be expensive. It can literally be a pen and paper. It can literally be you and 3 friends doing a reading in the back room of a pub or a friendly bookshop, or and making that happen, which I think is one of the lovely things about poetry. It has a relatively affordable access point. It also has the potential for connection with each other and connection to a bigger group of artists and fellow poetry appreciators that you can connect into as well.
Yeah, that's lovely. I love that idea of community, and also Amy talked about open mics too. So when you're doing, or you could describe it as research, it doesn't have to be you on your own reading. You can go to an open mic, and I love open mics because they're just like this anthology of different voices. And you get such a great variety, and then it's the conversations that happen afterwards. Oh, I liked that poet's poem because X. Oh, I'm not sure I did because X. It's just a really gorgeous way to create community, and also have some. It's about witnessing as well, witnessing different people's writing styles and so on. So it is a glorious, I always find poetry events joyful, even if the content of the poems are maybe quite dark or quite, emotionally stirring. I always find them joyful because it's about us being together, witnessing each other's craft. So yeah, I can really advise that. Great. I'm just going to now read a poem to lead into my next question. This is by the late and incredible Fleur Adcock, who passed away a couple of weeks ago. She wrote this poem a while ago, so it's a little bit dated, but I'm going to read it, and then we'll just use that as a springboard for some reflection. So it's called The Prize-Winning Poem. I guess it's talking more about competitions than publication, but it's quite transferable. So it's called The Prize-Winning Poem by Fleur Adcock. It will be typed, of course, and not all in capitals. It will use upper and lower case in the normal way. And where a space is usual, it will have a space. It will probably be on white paper, or possibly blue, but almost certainly not pink. It will not be decorated with ornamental scroll work in coloured ink, nor will a photograph of the poet be glued above his or her name, and still less a snap of the poet's children frolicking in a jolly game. The poem will not be about feeling lonely and being 15, and it will not be about the Queen. It will not be the first poem the author has written in his life, and will probably not be about the death of his daughter, son, or wife, because although such elegies fulfills a therapeutic need, in large numbers they are deeply depressing for the judges to read. The title will not be Thoughts or Life, or I Wonder Why, or The Bunny Rabbit's Birthday Party, or In Days Long Gone By. 'Tis and 'twas and and ere, and such poetic contractions will not be found in the chosen poem. Similarly, cliches will not abound. Dawn will not herald another bright new day, nor dew sparkle like diamonds in a dell, nor trees their arms outstretch. Large, meaningless concepts will not be viewed with favour. Myriad is out. Infinity is becoming suspect. Aeons and galaxies are in some doubt. Archaisms and inversions will not occur. Nymphs will not their fate bemoan. Apart from this, there will be no restrictions upon style or tone. What is required is simply the masterpiece we'd all write if we could. There's only one prescription for it. It's got to be good. Okay. So, she's not necessarily right, but I thought it would be quite interesting as a line of discussion what not to do when you're submitting poems for publication, or if there's anything from that poem you'd like to pick up on that she talks about. Yes, anyone want to go first? Amy, are you ready? Yeah?
Yeah, I think I've jumped in without necessarily knowing what I'm going to say, but I'll start by saying always follow the publisher's guidelines. That is a do rather than a don't, but there's obviously a reverse that comes with that, because, you know, sometimes people do ignore the guidelines, or sometimes they think, well, my work's really special, so I can send it outside of this window and it will get read. You know, all those guidelines are just to make it possible for the editors to do their job. So as soon as you get a submission that kind of ignores them, it's a red flag.
And how frequent is that?
There'll be a few of them in every window, or out of the window, because like the most common thing, I suppose, is that people submit, you know, when you're not open for submissions. Okay, you know, if someone submits and they haven't, they've kind of just picked your name, you know, they've not taken the time to know who you are as a press, who your editors are. That sort of information is usually pretty easy to find. So it's, you know, if you can address the submission to the editors by name, if not, then dear editors. But the worst one that comes up at all of these panels is dear sirs. Do not do it. I am a woman. Many great indie presses are edited by women. Just don't do it. It's easy to avoid. I'm
interested. Does that then cause the Horns effect, and you're not going to read the poems? Or?
We might read the poems,
but it's not a good idea.
It's not, like, the thing is, I think people. It's a small number of people that will kind of make these mistakes. Most people go, you know, will actually really agonise over how to write the cover letter, and the truth is, well, certainly in our case, it's not rocket science at all. Like, you don't need to wow us in the cover letter. You don't need to dazzle us by kind of telling us what your book's about. All you need to do is kind of not get in the way of your work by pissing us off, basically. Like, we just want to get to your work. We just want to open that attachment and see the words.
Brilliant. Jane, anything?
Yeah, I think that sense of anything that sort of impedes your work as an editor when you've got 100 or 150 or 200 submissions to work through, generally it's the things you notice that you don't appreciate. So if it does hold you up in reading the work, then that is something you're going to notice. And if it is something like a dear sirs, or ignoring your guidelines in some way. So I think simply just follow the guidelines. Don't worry, again, to reflect what Amy was saying, too much about the cover letter. In fact, so often I've read the poems first and then gone to the cover letter. I'm sort of usually just have puppyish excitement to read the poems. So I tend to dive in and read those, and then if I'm interested, I think, oh, let's see if there's a little bit more about this writer. If I've not heard of them before, I'd be interested to see where their work's been, or what they have to say in their cover letter about their collection, maybe. But those kind of things, keep them short and sweet, and just give us things that are useful to know about. Tell us what you're involved in. More than anything, an editor wants to know that you're active, that you're part of the poetry world in some way, in a sort of self-motivated way, whether that's by, you know, sort of sending your work out and being published in magazines, or whether it's by being involved with open mics, or even like a local feedback group, or you've read at a festival. Tell us those things, because they're really good to know, because it tells us that there's a hinterland as well. And also, sometimes it's really nice when somebody says, by the way, I'm actually, you know, a paramedic and I write poetry, or, you know, I work full-time as an engineer, and poetry writing is something I've been doing for the last 5 to 10 years, you know, and doing workshops or whatever. Sometimes that detail's really nice, because it just says, you know, this writer is thinking about themselves and what they have to bring to the work as well. That's interesting to know about as well. But generally, actually, don't worry too much about those things, because really it's the poetry that matters. And I think in terms of submissions, and funny enough, that Fleur Adcock one really wanted me to go away and sort of like a challenge to write a poem with aeons in it. Because it's interesting, isn't it? I do think as well that we can become so worried about all the shoulds and mustn'ts that sometimes it gets in the way of the creative work. So again, getting out of our own way a little bit with things, and just getting on with writing some really good poems and not worrying too much about whether we've got a shard somewhere in there that the editor may not like, or an aeon. You know, if they're good poems, they can survive the odd shard and aeon. So,
and iridescent is apparently another one. But yeah.
I've had people say that you shouldn't write poems about the moon, and I think like I think you can write about anything you want to, as long as you do it in a way that's you. You know.
Yeah, I think you can make anything work, really. An urban fox is another one. Apparently, there's loads of poems about urban foxes, but there should be more, I think, because I love urban foxes. Yeah, Fahad, anything from you about what not to do?
Yeah, I mean, because over 90% of submissions we get are from agents, any advice I would give would be directed to agents, and I don't necessarily want to do that here. But I guess in terms of maybe what not to be concerned about as a writer based on the poem by Fleur, maybe don't worry too much about whether you're writing in like whatever the mode of writing is at the moment, or feel like you have to like follow any particular kind of trend. As everyone said, like, if the work is great, the work is great, and it is our job to edit. Like that is our role, so we can have some kind of we can kind of work on that. So don't feel like you have to follow whatever's popular at the moment at any given time.
Oh, such nice people. Like, you've twisted my question to turn it into don't worry, don't feel. It's lovely. It's really reassuring.
Add something that's a bit of a sort of lateral step, but it does relate to the question, is also be wary when you are submitting, and like if you get an offer from someone. There are some, I'm just thinking about, say, like hybrid presses, or there are some presses where, or sometimes an author's got in touch with me and said, oh, I've had an offer, but they've asked me to pay this amount of money up front for print run or editing or whatever. If you're going with a sort of self-publishing or a hybrid model, that's fine, but if that's not what you're looking for, a traditional publisher should never ask you to pay for them to publish you, basically, and they should be working with you and doing the editing and putting the time in to develop the book and create an audience for it. On the flip side of that, also be careful about how much you want to inquire about the deal at the start. I've had people submit and in the submission email kind of say, but I want to know about the royalties and what the deal is and when it's going to come out. And you know, you can find all that out if you get the offer, and then you can still say no if it's not a good deal. But asking that before you've had any response can put the editors off.
Yeah. Interested in royalties in poetry as well. It's brilliant, though. Great. Okay, this has been fascinating, really interesting. And so now we have time for some questions from you guys. Before we do, I'll just say about questions. Can you make sure they are questions, not statements? And something that we can all benefit from. So I think there's a roving mic, is there? Is there a roving mic? Or we can just project. Okay, yeah.
When the word is hurry up versus yalla yalla, I remember Sarah yalla yalla, or TK, where my head will tilt because I'm of some mixed Indian descent as well. What's your stance in now and again throwing in one of my original languages because there's no other way I can resonate that same feeling in an English language?
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to repeat the question for the transcript. So really interesting question, actually. So what's your stance on including languages other than English if there's no other way that you can translate the word?
Yeah, we've done this, but we do this quite often in our work. We'd absolutely welcome that. And it's not, I don't think it's even a question of there's no way to say it in English. It's, you know, you're enriching the work with that kind of texture and that language, and So yeah, that comes up quite often in our books. It's not an issue.
Cool, lovely. Anything else?
I was going to say, I think it's pretty standard in poetry now to have collections that include multiple languages, especially when there is no direct translation for a phrase, a word. And if that's the intention of the work, that's the intention of the work. I think it's pretty standard nowadays.
Perfect, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And writers like Romelin Ante, I think, have been really key in lots of ways of not always necessarily translating things. Sometimes there are translations. Sometimes it's the context of the poem that makes the meaning clear of the words that is used. A writer I've worked with, Jennifer Wong, she's a Hong Kong Chinese writer. Sometimes she has included phrases that she has translated. Sometimes she hasn't. Sometimes the phrase is there and is not translated because sometimes it's partly about the context around it, and sometimes it's partly because she wanted that to be there. Literally, that was how she wanted the poem to be, and it exists in those different parallels of language as well for readers. So it's about honouring the intention of the writer, really, and making sure that that's the right thing for them.
Lovely, very reassuring answer. Fantastic. Next question. So, is that your hand? Just yeah, white top. Yeah, here.
Hey, yeah, so my question was, I guess this is one that's more for bigger presses rather than indie presses, but I think it kind of applies to everybody. How important, when selecting manuscripts to potentially take into full publishing, is it that the poet who submitted has their work out there already in various places and they already have an audience for themselves? So like, theoretically, could a brilliant young writer submit like a brilliant manuscript but have no footprint anywhere within the poetry world? Would you still be likely to take that person versus someone who's sort of more known and easier to market, I guess?
Brilliant question, yeah, thank you. So how important is it for someone already to have made their mark? I like the word footprint in the poetry world. Or would you ever take someone who just isn't generally known? I'm guessing you mean magazines, competitions, things like that, yeah. Anyone want to take that question?
I think it might happen with a pamphlet. Pamphlets are, tend to be an emerging writer's kind of early step into publishing. It probably wouldn't happen with a collection, and even most of the pamphlets we publish, the writers would have some footprint, because the process is not even necessarily that you have to have had these milestones for their own sake, but that shows that you had this ongoing commitment to your craft and to the work, that it's likely to have got your writing to the level where it's ready to be published, that you would be taking those steps because they're kind of part of you honing your voice.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I don't know if I can add to that, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think it is an integral part of it, really. So generally for us, we would normally find with a voice that was doing something really interesting, exciting, that by reaching that point, they have encountered those steps. So it would be extremely rare, I think, to take a collection where the writer had never published any of it or never had previous sort of connection in some way, because it is part of that development of yourself as a poet for it to reach that point as well.
I'm thinking, I can think of one example actually, and that's Caroline Bird, who had a collection published with Carcanet when she was 15, I think. But she is truly one in a million, and she's amazing. Yeah, I don't think it would, I mean, for me, my pamphlet is comprised of 12 years of poems that were in magazines and competitions. But I don't want to depress you all, because that's just me. Awesome, thank you. That was a really useful question. Anyone else? Yeah, just in the front here.
as poets, we're like working on individual poems and not necessarily thinking about how they might fit together as a collection. And I wonder like what your advice would be for someone who's trying to go from having a bunch of poems to making them work together as a collection. Like what makes you feel like this is not just a series of good poems, but like this is a good collection?
Yeah, I really want to know the answer to this as well, actually, as someone who's written lots of poems about different things. So we're talking about thematic collections, to what extent it's important if you're creating a collection, should it be thematic? But what if you have lots of different poems about different things? Anyone want to take that question?
This is probably going to be quite an annoying answer, but I would say be open to the idea that your collection might not be the poems you've already got. If your poems are quite disparate, they might be part of your process of developing your voice, and then there might be another stage to come where you say, this is the collection I want to write, this is the heart of it, and now I'm going to write into that theme or that idea or that story so that I end up with something that's a cohesive whole. And that you don't have to do that. I know some poetry editors that are, very open to the sort of miscellaneous collection. Personally, I prefer to feel that a book really hangs together. Or I think there's a degree to which it will anyway, because all the poems have you in common. But often, I wrote a collection before I wrote the collection that was my first collection, and there was a process I was going through with those poems I needed to go through. But the end result of that wasn't to then publish that book. It just kind of got me to a different place with my writing that then enabled me to write the next book. And I know that can be quite frustrating when you're really excited and you're like, I want to get my book out, and it's easy to look at what your friends are doing and think, right, I need to have a book out by this time. And I think just try to kind of enjoy the ride and the process, and to be prepared to kind of take that time to work out what your book is and what you want it to be, and then how you write into that.
Amazing. Yeah. Anyone else?
I think maybe just to add to that, I think maybe intention doesn't always make a collection. A collection is perhaps something that kind of reveals itself to you over the course of a period of time as you're putting those poems together. The miscellaneous approach, I think, is something that's, like, without getting too much into the history of like 20th century poetry, for example, like the miscellaneous approach has had its time at various points over the last 100 years or so. But I think even if you look at those collections, there's something that really kind of draws them together, that kind of reveals itself as you read the work together. So I think as you're developing the work, rather than kind of forcing it, if something kind of reveals itself to you, you'll feel that moment and you'll know, okay, this is what I'm organizing around. This is what my brain and my interests are kind of circling around. This is kind of the furnace of the collection, and that will kind of, I think, reveal itself to you. It tends to be the experience when I speak to a lot of people who've put together their collection.
Lovely. Yeah. Anything, Jane?
I think the idea of it revealing itself to you is really interesting. And I know lots of writers will frequently say, I'm really worried because I don't think I've got a theme, or I'm worried that they may be miscellaneous. And actually, generally, the poets that are worrying about it aren't the ones that generally are having that issue. Because I think, as Amy said earlier, you've written it, so there's a sort of sense that your voice is in there. That cannot often be the uniting factor. Your experiences are in there too. And I had sort of personal experience of this in my first collection. I took a very long time to bring it together. I felt really stressed that it didn't... I felt I should go away and go to a shed somewhere and create this first collection. And I hadn't realised that in the process of attempting to work towards that point, I'd sort of accidentally written it. And it was only when somebody else read it and saw that unifying aspect of themes that I couldn't see because I was too close. So sometimes as a writer as well, it may be really good to step back, to get somebody else to maybe give you feedback on what they think the themes are that are going to unite your work. And then thinking, it's all in the selection quite often. So then take out things that are maybe making it feel more miscellaneous, because these are like your test pieces that you've made, and they may not necessarily need to go into that full collection. You can take those out. This will allow you to kind of hone away the things that are, really at the heart of what you're trying to do as a writer. And once you can start to identify and spot those in your own work a little bit more, you will start to see the other poems that might sit around that kind of little kernel of an idea. And sometimes, you know, writers will go and write a collection on a concept, on one idea, on one thing that really is driving them, you know, maybe an experience or maybe a historical event or whatever it is. And sometimes writers won't do that, and that's fine too, but there will be something that unifies it. It may be something more subtle, but it will still be there. I think I'd be more worried of just, you know, here's 50 poems on 50 different subjects. That would definitely be something that might be much harder to place with a publisher. Partly as well, and not because I'm saying you need to think about the marketing, but you do need to think about your audience and readers. And if you go into a shop and a book says, this book is about lots of different things, you're generally not going to pick it up. But if a book says, I'm about this, this is my subject, generally you're going to be more drawn if that subject speaks to you. So thinking about your readers, and some of it isn't about changing the poem, some of it's thinking about how you change, how you talk about the poems, how you communicate what it is your book or your poetry is doing.
Wonderful, such amazing answers. So thank you for that question. Brilliant. Any more questions? Yes, here in the middle. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I think the mic is just coming. Sorry. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you very much for all these great presentations and question and answers. My name is Pige Örer, and I'm a curator and writer based in London. I'm really interested in poetry and the fluidity of poetry into different disciplines such as contemporary art. And I'm also working with poets, forming exhibitions, forming different programs, including poetry. And I was wondering if about your vision to also embrace contemporary poetry from all around the world. And if this is the case, how do you interact with translated poetry? So you have been talking about like the presence, the visibility of poetry maybe in UK, but there's also poetry which is visible in different parts of the world. And when it's translated into UK, maybe it will be the first encounter with the readers here. So how do you kind of make a balance between, you know, this kind of interaction with international contemporary poetry? And my second question is more like a practical one. You have also mentioned that you get the majority of the submissions from the agents. So
sorry, that's just from
yeah.
me.
Penguin, yeah.
Okay, from Penguin. Then it's maybe a question to you. And if this is the case, if this is something that you recommend or you think that it is, it's a way to move forward for the poets who do not work with agents, or I don't know, or you are also open to, you know, independent poets submitting proposals if they have a, you know, better chance or less chance not working with agents. Thank you.
Okay, cool. I'll just do the second question first because it might be more cogent as it's just you really. Is it? How do you feel about agented as opposed to non-agented?
I guess speaking, I guess for myself personally, I've received submissions directly from authors before, and I've received submissions from agents. I wouldn't necessarily say that I have a preference, although my advice for authors who want to submit to some of the major, like the big 5 places here in the UK, I would strongly recommend working with an agent for a number of reasons. But I guess, yeah, personally, I've received submissions from both.
There's countless opportunities if you don't have an agent as well, like myself, for example, with the pamphlet competition with Live Canon, which is open. Cool. So your first question, which is really interesting. So the international contemporary poetry landscape, if you have a vision around that, if you do translations, and so on. So this would just apply to these 3 presses, but anyone want to answer that question?
From Nine Arches' perspective, we haven't tended to publish poetry in translation, but rather out of a sense that I feel it's a specialism, and for us, I would be really cautious of doing something that was outside of my own specialism as an editor. I think there are presses that are really good at doing translated poetry. And for that reason, I've tended not to, not for any reason other than simply it's not quite what we specialise in. Although we do work with writers who are writing in English as a first language, but often, like Jennifer Wong, that I spoke about earlier, Nina Mingya Powell's, writers who are coming from different locations in the world to write in the UK in English. But I have tended not to do translation just because I feel it's a skill set that I, as an editor, at the moment, as a publishing house, we don't currently have capacity to take it on, and I'd only take it on if I really felt that we had a translation poetry editor who had those experiences and knowledge, because it is a really important and specialised area. And I think there are great organisations like the Poetry Translation Centre, Modern Poetry and Translation, and others as well, and publishers who do have that I definitely recommend looking at.
Cool, thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, very, very similar with us. We haven't really published anything in translation. We have published work by international poets. We've published several poets from the US, but also poets from, also European poets. And we've just signed a poet based in Lebanon. And some of our books have quite a lot of other languages in them within the English, but not a fully kind of translated piece. We read a really amazing submission a couple of years ago that was a translation, and we nearly took it, but like you were saying, we kind of thought I didn't quite have that specialism, and I think if we'd had more capacity, we would have taken it, because it was, it would be quite an exciting thing to work on, but it just wasn't quite. We weren't quite ready for it, I think, at that point. But yeah, some presses are fantastic at that, so it's worth kind of looking into and seeing where those works might be best placed.
Yeah, National Poetry Library, which is just here in South Bank, that's a brilliant resource for finding out things. Anything from Penguin?
Yeah, so I work on a lot of translated work for our classics list, the modern classics list, some of it poetry. As far as I'm aware, and I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of every book Penguin has published in terms of poetry, I don't think we've published contemporary poetry in translation as of yet. I'm definitely interested in it. I read a lot of translated poetry from all over the world. We publish poetry both sides of the Atlantic, and there's definitely a heavy translation focus within our division specifically, not just because we work on classics, but also some of our non-fiction and fiction contemporary work is also in translation. So I think there's definitely space for it at Penguin. How that will pan out, can't say at this stage, I'm afraid.
Fantastic. We've got 2 minutes left, so anyone have a really quick question? Really, really, really quick, that we can answer really quickly. Yes, go for it. The mic is coming.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this question and answer. It's been really, really helpful. The question that I have is, what type of author or poet care is provided by all of your presses? In particular, I think the smaller presses, some authors or poets would come to you without agents, so what type of poet care is provided during the publishing process?
Oh, what a lovely question. So what kind of poet care is provided, especially for the small presses? Go for it. Go for it, Amy.
We work really closely with our authors for a lot of the process. It's essentially me doing kind of a number of different jobs along the route, which is quite nice because it means it's not kind of getting passed from person to person. So I will edit and then copy edit and then typeset and design and then kind of do the marketing. And this is often how it is with indie presses, that it's kind of one or two people doing everything. And while that means they can be quite stretched, it also means that you've got someone that is like a real champion for your book, that will love your book and be really, really invested in it. And everything we do is very collaborative, so we always get our authors' approval on the, on the proofing and the design. Nothing will kind of go out without you knowing about it.
Perfect.
So, yeah.
Cool. And Jane, 20 seconds, go.
Yeah, so we have a year-long process usually in the run-up to a book, working with the writer, doing many of those editing processes as well, and also things that structurally help a writer to know what's happening with their work. So we'd have contracts, we have royalties. We also have writers coming back for their third and fourth books with us, which is really important to us to kind of build that body of sort of work for that writer and to support and look after them. And also making sure that when that next collection comes along and they're feeling unsure about it, that we have a whole programme of sort of continual mentoring and editing with a lot of the writers we've worked with over the years, so they can come back to us as well, and they get input on their marketing and input on their design, similarly to they do at Bad Betty as well.
Awesome. Well, I'm sure you'll agree this has been an absolutely fantastic hour. I've learned so much as well. So thank you to all the panellists, and thank you to you guys for listening so well and for all your amazing questions. Okay. And best of luck to you all. Thank you.